Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elena Kussler. I am the Program Director here at the Parkinson Association of the Rockies, and I'll be helping facilitate today's presentation. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Dr. Baumgartner for joining us today and presenting on this topic. I know this has been a topic of much interest in our community for a while, so we're really happy to have him here today. A couple of things to mention before we get going in the main presentation. We will be holding a Q&A session at the very end of the presentation. There are a couple of different ways that you can actually ask your question. The first, if you navigate over to your Q&A or questions tab on your GoToWebinar panel, you can type your question in there and that question will come to me. I'll hold any questions to the end and ask them directly once we get to that section. The other option is there should be a little raise your hand function that will allow you to actually notify me, and then I will unmute you and you can ask your question verbally to Dr. Baumgartner. So hold your questions until the end. We'll get to them, I promise. There were a couple that were pre-submitted that we might mention as well in there. The presentation is being recorded, so we will have a recording of this available to you all in a follow-up email that will come out around this time tomorrow, and we will also be posting it on our YouTube channel, the Parkinson Association of the Rockies YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that, and you can watch this back whenever you'd like. There is a survey at the very end of the presentation. We really appreciate when we get our feedback from our community, so that way we can still build and better our programming all of the time. So take a minute. It shouldn't take any longer than 3 to 4 minutes. So go ahead and fill that out, and it'll come directly to us. We do have a couple of other upcoming webinars. All of these and our other programs can be found on our website, www.parkinsonrockies.org. Our educational webinars you can find at that same address, /educational seminars. And we have quite a few coming up, almost one every week in the month of March. So if you're interested in any of these topics, go ahead and visit that website, and the registration link should be right on there. So please check those out. Let us know what you think, and I think that's all from me now, so I'll go ahead and transfer over power to you, Dr. Baumgartner.
All right, thanks very much, Elena, and I just want to make sure that everyone is seeing my screen. Does that seem correct, or will be shortly here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Elena, and for the Parkinson Association of the Rockies for having me today. My name is Alex Baumgartner. I'm a Movement Disorders Fellow at the University of Colorado, meaning I am in the final stages of medical training, specifically to be subspecialized in movement disorders and Parkinson's disease. It's my pleasure to be talking to you today about alternative therapies in Parkinson's disease. We'll run through some slides, as Elena mentioned, and also have time at the end for question and answers. I was sent a couple of questions ahead of time, which I'll try and just mention in the talk if I don't have a slide specifically that addresses those questions. And my apologies that my video is not working, so you're unable to see me. I suppose that's just kind of the way life has been for the past year or so, but hopefully we'll be meeting in person sometime soon as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Just a word about any disclosures of or conflict of interest. I have no significant financial obligations or other relationships with any businesses, companies, pharmaceutical associations, anything like that to mention. We will talk about some off-label uses of certain products, in particular of cannabis. And it should be noted that every person with Parkinson's disease is unique, and so is their response to therapies, and that includes both traditional therapies, carbidopa, levodopa, your typical medications that your doctor may be prescribing, as well as the alternative therapies that we'll be talking about today. And I mentioned that just to say that, it's not uncommon to hear that, my neighbor, my friend, someone I met through the association did very well or had this incredible response to X therapy, be it a medication that may be prescribed or some over-the-counter or other alternative therapy. which does not necessarily, of course, guarantee results in you or in any other person, just to keep in mind as we talk about some of these alternative therapies. So a little bit of overview about what we'll talk about today. First, we'll just go over some definitions. We'll then talk about supplements such as vitamins, minerals, and tinctures. We'll talk a little bit about mind-body practices and what exactly that is and that means. And we'll spend a little time on marijuana in particular, as I know that's typically a big question or area of interest for people with Parkinson's and people in general in today's society. And then we'll have some time for wrap-up and questions as well. So first, what are alternative therapies? The definition that is typically used is that alternative therapies are any sort of therapy or product outside the classical, and when I say classical, I mean Western traditional treatment of therapies or medications used to treat a specific disease. As you probably already know, there are several categories of alternative therapies. They include natural supplements like herbs, vitamins, minerals, probiotics, other excuse me, products you can buy over the counter. They include mind-body practices like yoga, acupuncture, mindfulness, relaxation, biofeedback, and then other systems of medicine that may fall outside of the traditional Western purview, which would include Chinese medicine, Eastern medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy, and others. A term that's been more recently come into favor would be complementary and alternative therapies, because for many people, both for physicians and for patients, really do act as a complement to the traditional therapies that may be prescribed in a clinic or doctor's office, so that they're working together and in parallel rather than two completely separate therapies or way of treating a disease. A little bit about some pros and cons of using alternative therapies. Some of the downsides that we deal with in particular on our end as physicians is that most Western medical schools, as in medical schools in the United States and Canada and the Western world, are not really teaching much about alternative therapies. You know, in the past few years, these have been increasingly recognized as important. And so there is a little bit of discussion going on in medical schools. I think, you know, looking back on my own experience, we might have had one, half day of class where we talked about alternative therapies, but this was a very, very minor part of the education of most of your physicians. Alternative therapies are not commonly reimbursed by insurers, which means that patients and their families are typically left with the cost. And that's what's shown here in this chart on the right side. This is not just for Parkinson's, but in the US in general, spending on behalf of patients on complementary and alternative therapies. And interesting to note that all of these are in the billions with a B, where people are spending upwards of $15 billion a year on things like supplements, over-the-counters, vitamins, natural products, close to $5 billion on massage, about $4 billion on yoga and other mind-body practices, similar for chiropractic and osteopathic manipulation, and around $3 billion on homeopathic medicine, which is to say that these therapies are commonly used by patients, and it's estimated that about 40% of the US population within the past year will have used some sort of complementary or alternative therapy. And that number is probably only going to continue to increase. And so what I just want to mention here is that there's obviously a big mismatch between the amount that people and patients are using or exploring these therapies and often what your doctors and other providers may know about them. So a little bit about vitamins, minerals, tinctures, over-the-counter supplements. First, it's important to know that these are generally not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, meaning that the amount of a certain product or active compound that's going into any sort of supplement you may buy over the counter is not really well regulated, controlled, or monitored by the FDA, as it would be for a standard medication that you would be prescribed, like carbidopa, levodopa, or others. It is over the counter, but that does not mean it's totally without side effects. And in some cases, given the kind of lack of oversight or control from the FDA, the side effects can be unpredictable and may not be very minor. As an example, St. John's wort, which is an over-the-counter supplement often taken for a variety of symptoms, both in Parkinson's disease and other non-neurologic diseases, can have serious interactions with other medicines, can carry a risk of increasing blood pressure and having otherwise unwanted effects on the cardiovascular system. In a word, when it comes to Parkinson's disease, we do not have any evidence that a dietary supplement, mineral, tincture has any evidence to slow, halt, or alter the progression or the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, the same could be said for any sort of traditional therapy like carbidopa, levodopa, any other medicine you would be prescribed. We have no medication that can slow or alter the course of the disease, nor can things like DBS or deep brain stimulators slow or alter the course of the disease as we know so far. These are some supplements in particular that have been studied in Parkinson's disease. So vitamin E, CoQ10, creatine, ginseng, ginkgo, uric acid, and St. John's wort. All have been studied in fairly well done and well designed trials in Parkinson's, and not shown any sort of significant effect on the course of the disease or really on the symptoms themselves. There are some others that have had very little and probably under-powered studies and may deserve some further interest or study in the future, and those would include things like green tea polyphenols. And there are some that have just been not studied at all, so we really can't say a whole lot about their efficacy in Parkinson's disease. But the bottom line is that we don't have any substantial evidence at this point that over-the-counter supplements, herbs, minerals, tinctures, etc., have any significant effect on Parkinson's symptoms. One mineral or over-the-counter substance that deserves some specific mention is Mucuna pruriens. This is a tropical legume grown most commonly in Southeast Asia and Central America, whose leaves actually do contain, whose seeds contain levodopa, which is the active compound in many of the most commonly used medications to treat symptoms of Parkinson's. Those would include things like Sinemet and Rytary. And levodopa is the precursor of dopamine, which is exactly what we're trying to give back to the brain in people with Parkinson's to supplement the dopamine that they're no longer producing in their own brain. So it certainly makes sense that taking this over-the-counter Mucuna would be able to ameliorate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It's actually been used in the Ayurvedic medicine tradition for a long, long time, going back thousands of years to treat symptoms of Parkinson's disease. We know more recently from studies that it probably takes about a fourfold higher dose of Mucuna to achieve the same effects as traditional levodopa that you might get in Sinemet or something like that. And that's from a number of studies that have looked at a small number of patients and actually compared the concentrations of levodopa in the blood after taking traditional Sinemet and then after taking Mucuna. And one important thing to note is that of course that Mucuna does not contain carbidopa. Carbidopa is the other medicine that's paired with your levodopa in medications like Sinemet or Rytary that prevents some of the unwanted side effects of those medications, in particular nausea and upset stomach, and also helps increase the concentration of levodopa in the brain. So it certainly is just worth mentioning that there may be a higher chance or risk of side effects like nausea and upset stomach in people using Mucuna. Now, focusing on exercise, I just wanted to say that it's been said over and over again that exercise is one of the mainstay treatments of Parkinson's disease due to its ability to improve numerous symptoms. And those include things like walking, balance, fatigue, depression, and memory. And we could have a whole separate talk on the importance of exercise in PD, why we should exercise, what we know about the benefits of exercise in Parkinson's. And so that being said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, except to say that every person with Parkinson's should be exercising to the best of their ability. Traditionally, the goal we give to people is about 150 minutes a week of exercise, which averages out to 30 minutes 5 times a day if you were to do it like that. I think there are a couple of interesting aspects of exercise in Parkinson's that are worth mentioning. One here that's pictured on the right is the TheraCycle. This is a stationary bike that actually has a motor, which is down right here kind of in front of the wheel and where your feet go, that will supplement the motion and the motor activity of the cycle to basically kind of drive the exercise and actually force you to exercise or turn the wheel a bit faster than your natural rhythm maybe, which can be particularly useful for people who experience a lot of fatigue or have a difficult time achieving a 30-minute exercise program on their own. One other, I think, thing worth mentioning, and maybe is historically how we got interested in exercise and the importance of it in Parkinson's disease, is something called whole body vibration therapy. Kind of like those old vibrating bands like you'd almost see in the kind of 50s, 60s home remedies that were sold to people to slim down their abdomen or define their abdominal muscles. But by a similar token, this therapy works by vibrating muscles throughout the whole body. And the way that that came to be is somewhat interesting. And actually back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when we were first figuring out what exactly Parkinson's disease was, it was noticed that people who came from the country into the city on a long journey to see the doctor actually seemed to do better when they were in the clinic after that long journey. And that probably relates to the fact that the roads were bumpy and the carriages were vibrating the whole trip into the city. And these people, at least for a short period of time, looked better than they typically do from a Parkinson's standpoint, meaning their tremor might be a bit better, maybe moving a bit quicker than average. That's a short-lived benefit, probably on the order of a few hours. But I think interesting to note that for some reason, this small amount of vibration throughout the body does temporarily seem to improve the symptoms of Parkinson's. So just a few other mind-body practices that I think it's worth going over and mentioning. The first would be Tai Chi or Qigong. These are two different mind-body practices. Tai Chi, probably most of us have heard of. It's an ancient Chinese martial art combining deep breaths, relaxation, slow and fluid movements, as well as certain postures. And that's what you see here on the right side is some people practicing Tai Chi. Qigong is a similar, although older, Eastern medicine mind-body practice that involves mostly meditation and slow movement. And these are used commonly in the Western world today, both as mind-body or mindfulness practices, as well as exercise programs. So what do we know specifically about Tai Chi and Qigong in Parkinson's disease? It's been well studied and has been proven safe and feasible for people with Parkinson's to do. People find that they're able to achieve the postures, movements, and breathing techniques that are a part of Tai Chi. In some studies, people have reported increases in their quality of life after going through a Tai Chi program. There's at least some studies that suggest that it may help with balance and stability compared to a standard exercise regimen, which consists of stretching, strengthening, that sort of thing. It's worth mentioning that not all studies that have looked at Tai Chi in Parkinson's disease have replicated that finding, but there is some suggestion that it may be helpful for balance. There's less study of Qigong in the Western world, but at least in some studies there has been a suggestion that it may improve some symptoms of Parkinson's like sleepiness or fatigue. A word about dance. I'm sure we all know what dance is, but worth mentioning that there have been several studies looking at particularly the tango dance in Parkinson's disease. They looked at the tango dance because it's a very complex dance that requires, one, both balance, memory of certain steps and moves, a lot of social interaction with your dance partner, as well as the rest of the people on the dance floor, and learning these complex dance moves. And it's by no means only for people that are young, fit, and ripe for participating in Dancing the Star or something like that. Here you can see this is actually a dance tango program for people with Parkinson's. What do we know in terms of what studies have shown about dance in Parkinson's disease? At least a couple studies that are out there have shown that people report that their thinking and memory is better after a 12 to 24 week dance class. Now that's certainly quite a commitment to go for about half a year at the most of regular dance class. But in a couple studies, we do think that it does seem like there can be some benefit on performance on thinking and memory tests. There's at least one study out there that showed that people's balance may be improved compared to a standard exercise regimen. And some other studies have shown some improvement in mood symptoms like apathy, social isolation, which I think makes a lot of sense if you're out there interacting with a dance partner and then a dance class and instructor as well. That mood, kind of social interaction, and all those things that we as humans are bred to enjoy may get a bit better. Talk a little bit about yoga and mindfulness. Yoga, of course, in the past couple decades has really entered the Western world and become is really a part of everyday life for many of us. But it's an ancient, again, Ayurvedic tradition that combines movements, focusing on the breath, and also meditation, mindfulness, relaxation, and breathing techniques. Mindfulness, again, in the last few years, has become increasingly synonymous with Western life, and it's a form of meditation that really focuses on thoughts, behaviors, in that way, without so much of a focus on movements, stretching, balance, etc. This is something that people are doing increasingly in the small chunks of the day that they may have 5, 10, 15 minutes available on their own. And even in the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen even apps really explode on the scene that are focused exclusively on mindfulness. A common example is the Headspace app that goes through a mindfulness program with you just in your phone in the few minutes of the day that you may have on your own. So what do we know from studies? There have been several studies in Parkinson's disease that show that yoga and mindfulness exercises have improved mood and self-reported quality of life. Other studies are mixed and really haven't shown much of a benefit. But again, there's very little downside to doing things like yoga, mindfulness, and meditation. Okay, what about acupuncture? I know that this was one of the questions that had been submitted ahead of time. First of all, what is it? It's an ancient Chinese medicine involving insertion of tiny needles, somewhere between 5 and 20 of them, into different points in the skin. And the idea being that inserting these needles will help regulate the flow of energy and balance throughout the body. What do we know about acupuncture? In general, it's safe, even for people who maybe have a risk of bleeding. These needles are very, very small, though in a very small number of people, there have been reports of complications, things like bleeding or needles being inserted where you would not want them inserted. That is a very low risk unless you're dealing with a very unexperienced provider or acupuncturist. There have been some studies on the benefits of acupuncture in Parkinson's disease. The bottom line is that the results are mixed. Some maybe suggested a bit of a benefit. Some of the benefits may be anecdotal, meaning that there's not really what we call a control group or a group, let's say, who did not get acupuncture, who had some sort of comparison to the acupuncture. And in those studies, people often report that they may experience some benefit or some improvements. There have been a couple studies that have shown at least self-reported or patient-reported improvements in mood and quality of life after acupuncture. Some of the most rigorous studies actually of acupuncture were done here just a few years ago by Dr. Benzie Kluger, who was a former member of this department, but is now living and working in Rochester, New York. He did a really interesting study where he actually compared real acupuncture to what's called sham acupuncture, meaning that people were just kind of poked. They were not aware whether they were getting real acupuncture. They were kind of poked with a little toothpick, but did not have anything inserted into the skin. Which allows us to really compare the true effect of the acupuncture versus maybe thinking you were getting acupuncture. And specifically, they looked at improvement in fatigue, which is obviously a very common symptom of Parkinson's. And they found that there was no significant improvement in people's fatigue between getting the true acupuncture and this kind of sham acupuncture where they were just poked with a toothpick. All right, I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about marijuana. So first, a few definitions. One, let's start with cannabis. Cannabis refers to any product of the cannabis sativa or indica plant, which are two of the most common cannabis plants that are grown. When we use the term marijuana, typically that refers to specifically cannabis products that contain THC, one of the active cannabinoids found in the cannabis plants, and specifically in the leaves and flowers. Hemp refers to any sort of cannabis plant or product, generally with very little THC, and a definition that's used is commonly less than 0.3% THC. I mentioned the word cannabinoid before. That's any sort of active compound in the cannabis product. Two of the most common that we care about are THC and CBD, although there are actually close to 100 cannabinoids found in the cannabis plants. THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the more psychoactive compound and can lead to the high and other what we call psychoactive effects of the cannabis. CBD is the non-psychoactive component, and so does not lead to things like a high, but can have various other benefits, but also, of course, risks. Just a word about, obviously, legal issues. We know that in Colorado, cannabis is legal for adult use in a recreational as well as medical setting. That is true in several other states, especially in the West, and a few in the Midwest and in New England. But many of our neighbors do not have the same programs. And I know that certainly we see a decent number of patients from Nebraska who are in no way allowed to purchase cannabis products. Same is true for Kansas. Several of our other neighbors also have either medical or some kind of amalgamation thereof programs. But it's just worth noting that a lot of this, legal issue does make studying cannabis quite difficult because it's still considered a Schedule I or a legal drug on the federal scale. And so getting things like the government or the National Institutes of Health to help pay for or fund studies of cannabis in Parkinson's disease and others can be quite difficult, even though it can be done. But that has led to a lot of the difficulties with really obtaining high quality evidence of the use and the effectiveness of cannabis in Parkinson's disease. Is there's so much variability in terms of what product is studied, how much of it is studied, how long people use it for, etc. So what do we know about marijuana use in Parkinson's specifically? Well, most of the data we have so far really comes from surveys of people who use marijuana, saying, do you use marijuana? How much do you use? What side effects, what benefits have you noted? And from that, we can say that there is certainly a chance of improving some symptoms like sleep, agitation, anxiety, depression, pain, and even tremor in about 40 to 60% of people. So kind of right around half of people may experience some sort of benefit from using cannabis or cannabis products. Other symptoms that are less likely to improve would be a lot of what we call the motor symptoms. And those would include things like dystonia, rigidity, muscle cramps, dyskinesias. Dyskinesias are those extra fidgety, wiggly movements that people often get after taking a dose of levodopa. These can improve in about 25% of people, meaning that in about 75% of people, they don't improve. And we also see that some symptoms get worse with cannabis use, and those can include cognition, balance, hallucinations, daytime sleepiness, dry mouth, dizziness, and fatigue. It's worth noting that for the most part, these adverse effects or side effects that people experience typically are not new. So it's less likely, though not impossible, that someone who's never had problems, let's say with hallucinations before, would use cannabis and then develop hallucinations. But in someone who may have had some problems with hallucinations in the past, or may experience daytime sleepiness, fatigue, etc., they may reappear or make it worse with cannabis. So what should we be using, or what are people using out there? THC, the psychoactive or sometimes leading to a high compound, or CBD, the non-high producing, the non-psychoactive component. And we know again mostly from surveys of people with Parkinson's that people who use it recreationally, meaning they do not have a prescription or a medical marijuana card, typically use more THC products. The medicinal users, those who have a medical marijuana card and get the marijuana through a dispensary, but as prescribed by a doctor, more typically use the CBD products. And I have here that THC may be higher risk, but also higher reward. And what I mean by that is that in terms of higher reward, people who use THC compounds often report more symptom improvement and more drastic symptom improvement on some of those things I mentioned before, like tremor, like appetite, that sort of thing. And the magnitude of the improvement may be larger. They also may be more able to reduce their other medications like carbidopa, levodopa, than people compared with people who use CBD products. But it also comes at a higher risk, meaning that people are more likely to experience some of the side effects we mentioned, maybe worsening balance, dizziness, daytime sleepiness or fatigue, and some trouble with thinking or memory. So the bottom line here is, I think, stay tuned about marijuana use in Parkinson's. So far, out of a lot of studies that have looked at this, only one has shown a significant demonstrable improvement on levodopa-induced dyskinesias. Those are, again, those extra fidgety, wiggly movements that people usually get after they take a dose of the carbidopa levodopa. But other studies that have looked at this really haven't found that same benefit. And as I mentioned before, that's probably due to things like some inconsistency in what product was studied, how long it was studied for, what type of patients were studied, that type of thing. So certainly more studies are needed. As of today, the American Academy of Neurology, or AAN, which is our kind of governing and supervising body of neurologists, it's a national organization, does not support the use of or any sort of therapeutic benefits of cannabis for any neurologic disorder, and that would include Parkinson's disease. A few years ago, they put out this kind of summary statement that said that there's moderate evidence for the use of cannabis in Parkinson's disease, but it's probably not effective for treating levodopa-induced dyskinesias based on the evidence we have so far. However, they do support the reclassification of cannabis used for medical purposes from Schedule 1, meaning that it's very difficult to study and is a federally prohibited drug that would fall in the same category as things like heroin, to Schedule 2, meaning a substance that can be more easily obtained for study purposes. We think that, we don't have a whole lot of high quality evidence about the use of cannabis. Some studies, surveys of patients have suggested that there may be some benefit, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to study this in a more rigorous way to really determine what it may help with, what the side effects might be, and what it might not help with at all. Just a little word about getting medical marijuana in Colorado. This is straight from the state's websites, which you'll see here, medicalmarijuana.colorado.gov. There are a few steps that are involved. The first is visiting a provider that is willing and able to provide medical marijuana prescriptions. Most of us in the Movement Disorders Center at the University of Colorado do not do this, but we certainly are happy to provide names and recommendations of marijuana prescribing physicians. You'd obviously need to meet with them, go through an examination and discussion about the risks and benefits of using medical marijuana. If they do write a prescription, you then get a few pieces of information, which again comes straight from the state's website. You need a valid Colorado ID or driver's license. You need your social security number. For people that want to have a caregiver, meaning someone else that would go to the dispensary for them and be able to purchase and obtain the marijuana and then bring it back home to them, you'd also need their information. There is a small fee associated with this application. That's $25, so you need to be able to pay the $25 application fee. You go to the website here to apply and complete your registration. Again, that's medicalmarijuana.colorado.gov. You get an email, you make an account, and once that's all processed, then you obtain a medical marijuana card that you would take to the dispensary to be able to purchase the marijuana. So just by way of summary, again, I think it's worth mentioning that so far we have no evidence that any dietary supplement, over-the-counter, herbal, mineral, etc., has the ability to slow down, halt, or alter the progression of Parkinson's disease. We know that exercise is critical in PD, and the bottom line is that it's probably hard to do exercise wrong, but there are some forms of specifically exercise or mind-body practices like yoga, Tai Chi, and even dance classes that may provide some extra benefit for some symptoms, including sleep, balance, mood, and social interaction. What we can say about marijuana so far is that there's no definite proven benefits, though we're hoping to be able to study it more, and hopefully in the next few years we'll know a little bit more about it. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'm happy to take any questions. In terms of the questions that I had seen before the talk, one I know was about acupuncture, which hopefully we covered, but I'm happy to chat a little bit more. I believe there was a question about one about bright light therapy in Parkinson's disease and its use for people with Parkinson's. So I'm sorry I don't have a slide about that, but what I can say is that bright light therapy, meaning usually obtaining a specific light with a certain number of lumens and a broad spectrum of the UV intensity, can be used to help regulate circadian rhythms and help fix certain sleep disorders or symptoms in the general population. There have been a couple studies that have looked at it in Parkinson's disease. And the best type of study, as I mentioned before, is one that compares the therapy itself, so in this case, the bright light, to something similar but without the same sort of effects, what we call a placebo or a sham or a control. There have been a couple studies that look at that, so people, using bright light therapy for about an hour or two a day compared to a regular light, like a low intensity red light that really wouldn't have the same expected benefit. And it turns out in both those studies that both people using the bright light and then the kind of control or the low intensity red light both reported some improvements in sleep and some of their sleep symptoms like fatigue or daytime sleepiness. So the evidence so far does not suggest that there's a strong benefit of the bright light therapy itself, but it seems to be a strong placebo effect, and there seems to be little downside, meaning that certainly bright light therapy may be useful. We can't say for sure now that there's a definite benefit of it compared to other similar therapies, but again, there's probably very little downside to doing it. And I think also there was a question about alternative therapies specifically for orthostatic hypotension, which refers to a sudden and dramatic drop in blood pressure when you go from a lying down position to standing up, which can be a very disabling symptom of Parkinson's. I think there are a few over-the-counter supplements that people have tried using for that symptom as well. One would be Yohimbe, and the names of the others are escaping me now. But again, we don't have any real evidence that provides any sort of significant effect compared to, again, a placebo or a sugar pill, basically. So that is all I'll say for now. But again, thank you very much for your attention, for Elena for hosting, and for the Parkinson's Association for having me. And I'd be happy to talk about any other questions that may have come up.
Okay, so we do have quite a few questions rolling in, and before we get to those, I just want to mention really quickly, during your presentation, I uploaded a handout of all of our exercise classes that we offer through the Parkinson Association, including some dance and yoga classes. So if you're able to download the handout, you can go ahead and download that, or it's available on our website. So just wanted to mention that really quickly. So let's go ahead and get going with some of these questions. The first question comes from Paul, and he asked this during the slide when you showed the cost of different alternative therapies. And he asks, you showed roughly 30 billion on alternative therapies. What percentage is that of standard treatments?
Oh, I think I know what you mean, compared to standard treatments. Yeah, that's a good question. I think annual healthcare spending, in the US is much, much higher than that, obviously, probably on upwards of trillions of dollars. So I don't know the exact percentage of how those would compare. I think it's generally a small percent. My guess would be maybe 5 to 10%. That's an estimate in my mind. but I think still a substantial number, or about $30 billion, obviously is pretty substantial in terms of spending on alternative therapy.
Okay, great. So this next question comes from Martha, and she asks, I have read that patients have experienced improvements in tremors with acupuncture. Is there any evidence of this?
Similar to what we talked about, there may be some reports that people have experienced improvements with tremor with acupuncture. Again, most of that comes from studies or reports where people may get acupuncture. You ask them, did your tremor improve? They very well may experience or feel that their tremor has improved. But what we really look for when we want to say that a medication or a therapy is effective is comparing it to the absence of that therapy. And so what we don't really have is a study that compared acupuncture to not getting acupuncture in a way that was blinded, or people were unsure of if they were getting the real treatment or a kind of sham or mock treatment. To say that that improves tremor. But certainly there may be some people who get acupuncture and do experience a benefit in terms of their tremor.
Great. So our next question comes from Tara, and I'll probably mispronounce this substance, but how does the mucuna pruriens figure into the levodopa paradox, i.e. more levodopa producing dyskinesias after about 5 years?
Can you read that one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure. How does the mucuna pruriens figure into the levodopa paradox, i.e. levodopa producing more dyskinesias after about 5 years?
I see. The short answer is we don't know. The studies that have been done on mucuna have, and so just to back up, what I think you're referring to is the fact that after a certain number of years of treatment with levodopa, people tend to experience these dyskinesias, meaning that we think that probably the level of the levodopa in their brain is too high. The studies I looked at and familiar with did not suggest or find much in the way of the mucuna itself producing dyskinesias, but we really don't have the numbers and the sample sizes to say with much authority. What we've looked at is, what people have looked at is a few, kind of a handful of people taking mucuna and looking at the effects that they experience. And those people generally did not have Parkinson's for very long, and so did not develop much in the way of dyskinesia after taking either mucuna or the traditional levodopa. So we don't know, but I think it stands to reason that if you were someone who was dealing with dyskinesia from your carbidopa, levodopa, Sinemet, Rytary, etc., it's certainly plausible that you may experience dyskinesia from mucuna, although, like I said before, it probably would take about 4 times the amount of mucuna to have the same effect as traditional levodopa.
Gotcha. Okay, so we actually have a raised hand from Carla. So Carla, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you can ask your question directly.
Hi, Carla.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Yeah, hi, I'm Carla Deanne Witherspoon, and I'm a certified light therapist, and just wanted to make a comment on the bright light therapy. There's many different types of lights out there, and they are not all, some are way better than others. There are class 2 medical devices that are on the market now that are getting really good scientific results back from their studies. With a photomodulation therapy, PBMT, using the LED technology. So I just wanted to give a website out, www.talkaboutlight.com, and it has some of these studies on it, and you can search that site for Parkinson.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it's evidence, based practices. So yeah, just be aware. There's lights that you can get on Amazon, for $9.99, and there's really good legitimate class 2 medical devices that are getting results, and that's what I'm using. I'm doing the light therapy in the morning, and these lights have frequency in them too. And so there's studies on the frequencies and the lights that are getting good results. So
Okay, I'd be interested to check that out. Thank you.
yeah, I don't know if you want I'll get your information. I wasn't able to get on my iPad, and I finally got on my laptop, so I don't, I'll get your information from Elena. So, okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, so our next question comes from Cindy, and she asks about boxing as a type of exercise.
Yeah, we love boxing as this type of exercise, in particular the Rocksteady boxing program that's been developed specifically for people with Parkinson's. I didn't mention it a whole lot today because I think, like I said, we could talk about exercise for at least an hour or several hours, but definitely a worthwhile class. I think that the things that boxing helps train are exactly what you want it to train in Parkinson's, which is balance, quick feet, being agile on your feet, moving back and forth, maintaining stability through your core, your big leg muscles, big abdominal muscles, keeping your hands active and moving, response time, complex movements that involve the whole body. And that's exactly what boxing is. That's exactly what we'd want to focus on in Parkinson's disease. So, anecdotally, I've had, people that have gone through the Rocksteady program or other boxing programs and love it. So I think it's definitely a worthwhile venture.
Yeah, we have a program here called Power Punch, and we never have trouble filling those classes for sure. People love it once they get into it. It's pretty great.
Social, usually in the big classes, people are all enjoying it. Definitely a great exercise.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question comes from Russ, and he asks, several years ago, I participated in a CBD study at UC Health with Dr. Leahy. Were there any conclusions made with that study?
Yes, with a caveat, that study did, you're right, occur here, and we're hoping that more will occur at the university. Study involved a pretty small number of patients. Conclusions were pretty similar to what I had showed you about, potential benefits in things like sleep, appetite, mood, with a very low risk of side effects. There was one thing that was monitored closely was blood work and liver tests. In some patients, there was a small and probably not significant increase in some markers of the liver enzymes. And that probably just has to do with the way that the drug is metabolized. But the purpose of that study was primarily the latter, to look at safety and tolerability, which is the way most studies are done, even looking at a very small number of patients to make sure it's safe, not causing significant interactions or other problems like liver damage, et cetera. And then once we know that, increasing the number of patients in the study to really look at benefits on a larger scale. And that's what we're hoping can come next, although I know that it's been hampered by a couple things. One is availability of the product, and then two, the COVID pandemic that really slowed things down.
Yeah, I'm sure. And we did have a couple of questions about whether you guys are doing any studies on either CBD or THC at this point. So
currently, not much that they're enrolling for, although we hope soon is the short answer. And so we do have a research coordinator and program here that can generally be found on our website, the neurology research at University of Colorado. If you navigate to the websites, and we hope that things are able to open up again soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Paul, and he asks, have you heard anything about Mannitol? Some studies in Israel appeared promising.
I know not as much about the Mannitol. I have heard from some patients that have used it. And I don't know, to be honest, Paul, about the quality of those studies from Israel. I've not looked at them. What we know in general is that Mannitol certainly is not without side effects. It's a very powerful, it's a sugar basically that's used to in some cases pull fluid out of the body and reduce swelling. So there are, depending on the dose, some risks of things like dehydration, excess urination, that sort of thing. But I apologize, I'm not too familiar with the studies that you're referencing from Israel.
Okay. Our next question comes from Timothy, and he asks, are there any benefits to improving gut health?
An interesting question, and I think the answer is it's certainly possible. We'll find out. There's a lot of interesting research that shows that possibly one of the places Parkinson's is in the gut, and it certainly stands to reason that improving gut health, for one example, very early on or even before the symptoms of Parkinson's start, could help modify the disease. That will probably be research that's going to be done, hopefully in the next maybe 5-10 years. But in terms of symptom management for Parkinson's, as you probably know, constipation and other gut issues are very common in Parkinson's, and improving things like gut health can be helpful. We don't have the evidence on a large scale that allows us to say that probiotics are helpful for every person with Parkinson's, but they may be particularly helpful for some people who deal with constipation on a regular basis, who otherwise may have had other intestinal issues, things like ulcers or ulcerative colitis, other gut diseases. So I wouldn't say that we'd recommend probiotics, for example, to every patient with Parkinson's, but for the right person, it's certainly a possibility, and it may involve talking with your Parkinson's doctor, but also with a GI specialist or gastroenterologist as well.
Great. So I think we have another raised hand. We'll give it a go from Marshall. Marshall, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you can ask your question directly.
Hi there.
May take a moment. Nope. All right. That's okay though. So we've got some more questions in our docket. The next one comes from Paul, and he asks, Michael J. Fox has sponsored a trial on transcranial direct current stimulation, which has also been explored as a way to improve performance in endurance sports. Any comment?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and transcranial magnetic stimulation has really exploded again in the last 10, maybe 20 years even. I think there is some very exciting possibilities, and what we know so far is that that is probably a very good therapy for especially mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and it's being used for those quite commonly already. It's being looked at for other things as well, including in things like Alzheimer's disease and for memory and cognition. As you mentioned, the Michael J. Fox Foundation is interested in studying it as well. I think it's a very exciting technology. I think there's a very good chance that we could find some sort of benefit. It's going to take some time to figure out what exactly that benefit may be. Like I said, certainly looking at things like depression, anxiety, other mood issues, thinking and memory and cognition, possibly hallucinations or other symptoms similar to that, and possibly even some of the motor symptoms, tremor, slowness, stiffness of Parkinson's disease. I think it's very exciting, and I do think there's a good chance, this is just kind of an estimate, but I do think there's a good chance that some of those studies do find some success.
Great. And another question from Paul. He mentioned a New York Times article recently cited studies that showing the transcranial alternating current stimulation may help depression and obsessive compulsion urges. Both of those are common in PD. Do you know of any research on these procedures for Parkinson's?
I don't. I'm sure it's being done by someone somewhere, but so far nothing has come out that's been, published and reviewed to my knowledge. But I'm positive it's being done out there. I can tell you there are at least, a couple of big centers that are really looking at this. One in Boston is Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, where they've been one of the earliest to foray to explore the transcranial alternating current magnetic stimulation. So it would not shock me if the research is being done, but so far we don't have much in the way of results or data about it.
Gotcha. All right, so this question comes again from Paul, and he asks, you said there was some speculation that marijuana might help sleep. What about REM sleep disorder in particular?
So far, not much. In particular, the benefits of on sleep have been with mostly things like insomnia, frequent wakenings, or needing to go to the bathroom throughout the night. Less so on REM sleep behavior disorder, and if you're experiencing that, you probably know that that's a very difficult, symptom to treat and to modify. Our understanding of why exactly you go into REM sleep, what controls being in and out of REM sleep, and what controls that disorder, the behavior disorder, is still really in the infant stages. We have not seen, to my knowledge, much benefit on REM behavior disorder specifically with marijuana.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question, and this question is coming in from Gregory, and he asks, what about stem cell research?
Okay, yeah, interesting one, and certainly something that will probably be studied more often, or increasingly more. The bottom line is the studies are mixed on stem cells. There are reports out there of people who have benefited from stem cells. And what I think is interesting, and it should be said that there are studies that really did not show much of a benefit of stem cells. So in that sense, it's not at the level where it's something that's being routinely recommended. Some of the problems that have hampered stem cell research are, for the vast majority of studies that have looked at this in Parkinson's disease, they've looked at using basically someone else's stem cells, either from a lab or from the source of another person, which usually requires things like immune suppression, kind of giving you medications to damp down your own immune system to allow the stem cells to populate and take effect, which comes with its own risks that mostly include infection and other side effects of medications. There was one study that actually was published, I believe about a year ago, maybe two now, in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was the first person to do this, who actually, they basically were able to grow and use the patient's own stem cells and deliver them into the brain to try and treat the symptoms of Parkinson's. So there's been, to my knowledge, one person that's gotten that in the world, and it was shown to be safe, and we'll still wait and see about data on the efficacy. But I think it's interesting that we do now have the capability to use your own stem cells to repopulate those dying cells in the brain in Parkinson's. We'll see if we see much of a benefit on Parkinson's. And obviously we're not at a stage yet where that's going to be something routinely offered, but it has been done, which I think is very interesting.
Awesome. Interesting stuff happening, I'm sure. So I think that's all we'll have today. We're right at an hour. So I want to thank you, Dr. Baumgartner, so much for your presentation and for answering all of our questions. It's really very much appreciated. Again, I'll mention there is a survey after the presentation. Please take a minute to fill that out for us. There will be a follow-up email with a recording, so you can listen back whenever you'd like. And with that, I will say thank you and have a great rest of your day.
And thank you, and thanks for all the excellent questions.
Yeah, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.